Sometimes the places we call home hold secrets we never imagined. For 42-year-old Bonnie Walsh, the West Virginia mountains had been her sanctuary for 40 years, until one morning changed everything. She was clearing brush from an old trail when her German shepherd started acting strange around a moss-covered hill. That's when she found the steel door hidden in the earth. The door was rusted shut and covered with decades of growth. When she finally got it open, stale air rushed out like a breath from the past. What she discovered inside wasn't just forgotten, it was deliberately hidden. Now Bonnie faces a choice that could change her quiet mountain town forever. But what secret was so dangerous it had to be buried for 30 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the ridgeline like a familiar embrace as Bonnie Walsh stepped onto her cabin's weathered porch, coffee mug in hand. At 42, she moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had walked these mountain paths for 4 decades. Her German shepherd Rex stretched beside her, his dark coat glistening with dew. This was their routine, had been since Robert passed 3 years ago, a quiet communion with the West Virginia wilderness that had become more home than any place she'd ever known. Bonnie's cabin sat nestled in a grove of old-growth maples, their massive trunks telling stories older than the mining towns scattered throughout these hills. She'd built this life deliberately, choosing solitude over the chaos of the world beyond the tree line. Robert had understood that need in her, the way she could read the forest like others read newspapers. How she found peace in the rhythm of seasons rather than the noise of civilization. The worn trail map tacked to her kitchen wall bore witness to decades of exploration. Hand-drawn in fading ink, it showed every deer path, every hidden spring, every rocky outcrop she'd discovered during her years as a volunteer trail maintainer for the State Park Service. Each line represented hours of careful observation, of learning the mountain's moods and secrets. She knew where the eagles nested, where the wild ginseng grew, where the old-timers had carved their initials into beech trees that now towered over newer growth. Rex nudged her elbow, his signal that it was time for their morning walk. He was getting gray around the muzzle. 10 years old now, adopted as a puppy from the county shelter after some fool had abandoned him on a back road. Robert had grumbled about taking in another mouth to feed, but within a week, the dog had claimed his spot by the fireplace, and Robert's heart along with it. All right. Boy, Bonnie said, scratching behind his ears. Let's see what the mountain has to show us today. She pulled on her worn hiking boots and grabbed her canvas work gloves from the porch rail. Today's mission was to clear the debris from the woodland trail, a neglected path that wound through the state forest adjacent to her property. Storm damage from the spring had left branches scattered across the route, and hikers had been complaining to the Park Service about the obstacles. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Though the trees still wore their late summer green, Bonnie breathed deeply, catching the scent of wild mint and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves. This was her meditation, her church, her therapy, all rolled into one daily ritual that kept her grounded and purposeful. As they walked, Rex ranged ahead, investigating scents and sounds that escaped human perception. Bonnie followed the familiar rhythm, her practiced eye noting changes in the landscape. A new beaver dam upstream had raised the water level in Miller's Creek. The oak trees showed signs of early acorn drop, suggesting a harsh winter ahead. These were the kinds of observations that had made her invaluable to the Park Service, despite her preference for working alone. The people in town respected her knowledge, but kept their distance. She wasn't unfriendly, just selective about her interactions. Saturday mornings at Henderson's General Store for supplies, occasional conversations with Patricia Vance at the library when she needed to research something about local flora or fauna, and polite nods to neighbors she encountered on the mountain roads. It was enough social contact to remind her she was part of a community without overwhelming her natural inclination towards solitude. Robert had been different, a geologist who'd come to study. the coal formations, and stayed for the woman who knew more about these mountains than any textbook could teach. Their courtship had unfolded slowly, like the changing seasons, built on shared silences and mutual respect for the land that sustained them both. His death, from a sudden heart attack, had left a hole in her daily routine that she'd gradually learned to navigate around. Like stepping over a fallen log on a familiar trail, the woodland trail began, where her property line met the state forest, marked by a weathered wooden sign that had seen better days. Bonnie pulled her loppers from the canvas bag slung across her shoulder and began the methodical work of clearing the path. Branch by branch, she restored order to the chaos left by spring storms, creating neat piles of debris that would decompose naturally over the winter months. Rex had wandered off to investigate something in the underbrush, his movements creating small rustles in the ferns that carpeted the forest floor. Bonnie worked steadily, losing herself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. This was honest work, the kind that left you tired but satisfied, connected to something larger than yourself. She was reaching for a particularly stubborn branch when Rex's sharp bark cut through the morning quiet. It wasn't his usual alert, the controlled woofs he used to announce squirrels or the occasional deer. This was different, urgent, and somehow fearful. Bonnie straightened, scanning the forest for whatever had caught his attention. "Rex! What is it, boy?" The barking continued, coming from a section of forest she rarely visited. The terrain there was steep and unwelcoming, thick with brambles and fallen trees that made passage difficult. But Rex's distress was genuine, and in all their years together, she'd learned to trust his instincts about things that weren't quite right. Bonnie picked her way through the undergrowth, following the sound of Rex's agitation. She found him circling a moss-covered mound that rose from the forest floor like a green burial mound. His hackles were raised, and he kept a careful distance from whatever had captured his attention, whining softly in a way that made the hair on Bonnie's arms stand up. The mound was larger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 8 feet wide and extending back into the hillside. Thick moss and decades of accumulated leaf litter had given it the appearance of a natural formation, but something about its shape struck her as too regular, too purposeful. Vines had grown over it in a tangle that suggested years of undisturbed growth, but underneath that green covering, she could make out harder lines that didn't belong in nature. Bonnie knelt beside the mound, brushing away moss and debris with her gloved hands. Her fingers found metal, cold, smooth, and definitely man-made. As she cleared more vegetation, the outline became unmistakable. A door, set deep into the hillside and sealed shut by rust and time. Her heart began to beat faster as she worked to expose more of the structure. This wasn't some old mine shaft or forgotten storm shelter. The construction was too deliberate, too well hidden. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal this entrance, and from the growth patterns around it, that someone had done so decades ago. Rex continued his nervous circling, occasionally emitting low growls that seemed to come from some primal instinct about hidden dangers. Bonnie sat back on her heels, studying the door she'd uncovered. Heavy steel, with hinges that had been engineered to last, though rust had claimed them now. There was a lock mechanism, but it too had succumbed to time and weather. She'd lived on these mountains for 40 years, explored every visible inch of the surrounding forest, and never suspected that something like this existed so close to her daily walks. The secrecy of it bothered her almost as much as the mystery of what lay beyond that steel barrier. Standing slowly, Bonnie made a decision that would change everything about her quiet mountain existence. She would find a way to open that door, despite Rex's obvious warnings, and her own growing unease about what secrets the mountain had been keeping from her. All these years, it took Bonnie 3 days to work up the courage to return to the hidden door with the tools she'd need to open it. She'd spent those days in a state of distracted restlessness, unable to concentrate on her usual routines. Even Rex seemed to sense her preoccupation, staying closer than usual and watching her with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold questions she couldn't answer. On Thursday morning, she packed her canvas bag with a crowbar a heavy-duty flashlight, and the portable radio she used for emergencies in the deep woods. The rational part of her mind insisted she should report the discovery to the Park Service or the county sheriff, but something held her back. A growing certainty that this secret had been kept for good reasons, and that involving authorities might do more harm than good. Rex was reluctant to accompany her back to the site, hanging behind as they approached the moss-covered mound. When they reached the clearing, he took up a position 20 feet away and lay down, chin on his paws, watching with the resigned air of a dog whose human had decided to do something monumentally foolish. The door looked less ominous in the morning light, more like an abandoned relic than a gateway to something dangerous. Bonnie had convinced herself that she'd find nothing more threatening than old mining equipment or perhaps a forgotten storage area for park maintenance supplies. The mountain was full of such remnants from earlier eras: concrete foundations from long-gone cabins, rusted machinery from failed mining ventures, root cellars that had outlasted the homes they'd once served. Working the crowbar into the gap between door and frame, Bonnie applied steady pressure. The metal groaned in protest, rust flakes falling like red snow as the hinges fought against decades of corrosion. It took nearly 30 minutes of patient work before something gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the forest. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing a breath of stale air that carried scents of old metal and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made Bonnie step back instinctively. Rex whined from his observation post, but made no move to approach. Bonnie clicked on her flashlight and peered into the opening. The beam revealed rough concrete walls and a narrow passage that extended back into the hillside farther than her light could reach. This was no natural cave or simple storage area. Someone had excavated this space with purpose and permanence in mind. She called out a tentative "hello," but received only the echo of her own voice in response. The absence of any reply was somehow more unsettling than if someone had answered. At least then, she'd know what she was dealing with. Taking a deep breath of fresh air before entering, Bonnie stepped across the threshold. The passage was just wide enough for one person, with a concrete floor that showed signs of regular use, despite the door's rusted exterior. After 20 feet, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber that her flashlight revealed to be roughly square, perhaps 12 feet on each side. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. The room was furnished like an office, though one that hadn't been occupied in years. A metal desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered with dust and the remnants of what had once been organized paperwork. Filing cabinets lined another wall, their drawers partially open, as if someone had left in a hurry. But it was the equipment that truly captured her attention. Banks of electronic devices that looked like radio or surveillance gear. Their screens dark and silent, but somehow still radiating an aura of watchful purpose. Bonnie approached the desk slowly, her flashlight beam dancing across scattered papers and manila folders. Most of the documents were too water-damaged or faded to read clearly, but she could make out official-looking letterheads and what appeared to be surveillance reports. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a folder that had fared better than the rest. Inside, she found a photograph that made her breath catch in her throat. 5 men in dark suits stood in front of what she recognized as the town hall, their faces serious and official. The photo was stamped with a date from 1993, and someone had circled one of the faces in red ink. She recognized 3 of the men immediately: Tom Bradley Sr., who had been sheriff before his son took over; Dr. Marcus Webb, who had run the town's medical clinic until his retirement; and James Morrison, who had served as mayor during the 90s, but it was the circled face that sent a chill down her spine. The man was older than the others, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to stare directly at her through the faded emulsion. There was something familiar about his features, though she couldn't immediately place where she might have seen him before. A rustling sound from the entrance made her freeze. Rex's anxious whining had stopped, replaced by the soft pad of paws on concrete. She turned to see his silhouette in the doorway, backlit by morning sunlight. He had finally overcome his reluctance to enter, but his posture remained tense and alert. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. Though she wasn't sure she believed it herself, Rex approached cautiously, nose working to process the complex scents in the confined space. When he reached her side, he pressed against her leg in a way that was both comforting and protective. Whatever this place was, it didn't feel abandoned to him either. Bonnie continued her exploration, opening filing cabinet drawers and discovering more photographs, documents that appeared to be surveillance reports, and maps of the surrounding area marked with cryptic symbols and notations. One map showed her own property, with her cabin marked by a small red X and what appeared to be observation points noted in the surrounding forest. The implications of that discovery hit her like a physical blow. Someone had been watching her home, documenting her movements, treating her property as a subject for surveillance. The violation of privacy was stunning, but it was the systematic nature of it that truly frightened her. This wasn't the work of some local busybody or harmless eccentric. This was professional, organized, and thorough. In the bottom drawer of the largest filing cabinet, she found equipment that confirmed her worst fears. Radio transceivers, recording devices, and what appeared to be encryption equipment, all of it more sophisticated than anything she'd expected to find in these mountains. Some of the devices still had power indicators that glowed faintly in the darkness, suggesting that someone had been maintaining this equipment more recently than the dusty surfaces suggested. As if summoned by her growing unease, one of the radio units suddenly crackled to life. A burst of static filled the chamber, followed by a voice so clear and unexpected that Bonnie nearly dropped her flashlight. "Unit 7. This is base. Report status." The voice was male, middle-aged, and spoke with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to giving orders. Bonnie stood frozen, afraid to move or breathe, as she waited to see if the transmission would continue. After a long moment, the radio fell silent again. But the message was clear. Whatever operation this facility had been built to support, it wasn't as dormant as the dusty surfaces suggested. Someone was still out there, still monitoring, still expecting reports from Unit 7. Bonnie realized, with growing alarm, that by opening this door, she had inserted herself into something far more dangerous than a forgotten piece of local history. This was an active operation, and her discovery of it had almost certainly been noticed by whoever was responsible for maintaining the equipment. Rex pressed closer against her leg, his warm presence a reminder that she wasn't alone in this subterranean tomb. But as she looked around at the evidence of systematic surveillance and organized secrecy, Bonnie couldn't shake the feeling that they were both now in more danger than they'd ever been during 4 decades of mountain living. The photograph with the circled face seemed to stare at her from the desk, its subject's eyes holding secrets that someone had thought worth burying. As the radio equipment hummed quietly in the darkness around her, Bonnie made a decision that would change her life forever. She wasn't going to report this discovery to the authorities. Not yet. First, she needed to understand what she'd stumbled into, who was responsible for it, and whether the danger was something she could walk away from or something that would follow her home. Taking the photograph and as many documents as she could safely carry, Bonnie began the careful work of documenting everything else with her phone's camera. Whatever secrets this mountain bunker contained, she was going to expose them to the light of day, even if doing so put her directly in the crosshairs of people who had already proven they were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to keep their activities hidden. Bonnie spent the weekend in a state of careful paranoia, studying the documents she'd taken from the bunker while keeping one eye on the windows of her cabin. The photograph haunted her, 5 men in suits standing like they owned the world, one face circled in red ink as if marked for special attention. She'd laid the documents out on her kitchen table, creating a timeline of dates and cross-referencing the faces with her memories of the town's past. Tom Bradley Sr., she remembered clearly, a stern man who'd run the sheriff's department with an iron fist until his retirement in 2001. Dr. Webb, had delivered half the babies in the county during his 40-year practice, earning a reputation for competence and discretion that had made him wealthy by local standards. James Morrison had been mayor during the town's brief economic boom when the coal prices were high and the mining companies were hiring. But the circled face remained a mystery, though something about the man's features nagged at her memory like a half-remembered dream. Monday morning found her at the county library 20 minutes before opening time, waiting on the steps with the patience of someone who'd spent decades observing wildlife. Patricia Vance unlocked the doors at 9 sharp, greeting Bonnie with the surprised pleasure of a librarian whose quiet domain was rarely visited so early in the day. Bonnie Walsh. "As I live and breathe," Patricia said, adjusting her reading glasses as she disarmed the security system. "What brings you down from the mountains so early?" Patricia was one of the few people in town Bonnie considered a friend, though their relationship was built more on mutual respect than intimate conversation. She'd been the head librarian for 15 years, replacing old Mrs. Henderson when arthritis finally forced her retirement. Patricia understood the value of both information and discretion, qualities that had served her well in a small town where everyone's business was potentially everyone else's entertainment. "Research project," Bonnie said, following Patricia inside. "I'm trying to identify some people in an old photograph. Local folks from the 90s. The lie came easily, though Bonnie felt uncomfortable deceiving someone she trusted. But the radio transmission from the bunker had convinced her that whatever she'd discovered was still dangerous. And involving Patricia without more information would be unfair to both of them. Patricia led her to the local history section, a collection of bound newspapers, high school yearbooks, and photograph albums that documented the town's evolution from mining camp to tourist destination. They worked together in comfortable silence, Patricia pulling volumes, while Bonnie searched through pictures of town council meetings, business openings, and civic events from the 1990s. It was in a 1993 issue of the County Herald that they found what they were looking for. A front-page article about a federal grant for rural law enforcement included the same photograph Bonnie had discovered in the bunker, though this version wasn't marked with red ink. The caption identified the circled man as Special Agent Robert Henshaw, representing the Federal Task Force on Rural Crime Prevention. "I remember him," Patricia said quietly, studying the photograph over Bonnie's shoulder. "He was around for about 6 months that year, supposedly helping coordinate some kind of anti-drug initiative. Quiet man, kept to himself mostly. Stayed at the Morrison Inn until he finished whatever he was working on." Bonnie felt her pulse quicken. A federal agent, working closely with local officials, whose presence had apparently warranted special documentation by whoever had established the surveillance operation. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a pattern, though she didn't yet understand what picture they were creating. "Did you know any of the other men in the photo?" Bonnie asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Patricia pointed to each face in turn. "Tom Bradley, of course, Dr. Webb, Mayor Morrison. The 5th one is Carl Winters. He was the county coroner back then. Retired and moved to Florida around 2000, if I recall correctly. 5 men, all in positions of authority, all working with a federal agent on some kind of law enforcement initiative." Bonnie made careful notes, though she could feel Patricia's curiosity growing with each question. "This wouldn't have anything to do with those strange questions you asked about local history last month, would it?" Patricia asked, her librarian's instincts detecting a pattern that Bonnie had hoped to keep hidden. The question caught Bonnie off guard. She'd forgotten about her casual inquiry into families who had left town suddenly. During the 90s, a conversation that had seemed innocent at the time, but now felt like a dangerous revelation of her interest in that particular period, just trying to piece together some family history, Bonnie said. But she could see in Patricia's expression that the explanation wasn't entirely convincing. They spent another hour searching through documents, finding additional references to Agent Henshaw's task force and the federal grants that had funded expanded surveillance capabilities for rural law enforcement. The more they uncovered, the more legitimate the operation appeared to be, which only deepened Bonnie's confusion about the hidden bunker and its sophisticated equipment. As they prepared to leave, Patricia touched Bonnie's arm gently. "If you're looking into something that might be dangerous, you should know that you're not the first person to ask questions about that time period." Bonnie felt her stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" "About 5 years ago, a young reporter from Charleston came through asking about federal operations in the 90s. He was particularly interested in families who had relocated suddenly. Very persistent, very thorough." Patricia paused, lowering her voice. "He had a car accident on Highway 9 about a week after his last visit. Single vehicle crash, went off the road in broad daylight. State police said he fell asleep at the wheel." The implication hung between them like a threat that neither woman wanted to acknowledge directly. But Bonnie understood the message. Her research was following a path that had already proven dangerous for at least one other person. "I appreciate the warning," Bonnie said carefully. Patricia nodded, then disappeared into the stacks for a moment before returning with a manila envelope. "These are photocopies of everything we found today, plus some additional material I thought might be relevant. Consider it a head start on your family history project." Walking back to her truck, Bonnie felt the weight of the envelope like a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. The radio equipment in the bunker suddenly seemed less like abandoned technology and more like an active threat, monitoring frequencies that someone was still using to coordinate activities she didn't understand. As she drove home through the mountain roads she'd traveled safely for 40 years, Bonnie found herself checking her rearview mirror more frequently than usual. The landscape that had always represented security and solitude now felt exposed and vulnerable, as if hidden eyes were tracking her movements from positions she couldn't identify. Back at the cabin, she spread Patricia's materials across her kitchen table alongside the documents from the bunker. The pattern that emerged was troubling in its implications. Federal agents working with local officials, families relocating suddenly, and a surveillance operation sophisticated enough to require permanent underground facilities. Rex watched her work from his favorite spot by the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head to stare at the door as if he sensed approaching danger. His unease was becoming contagious, and Bonnie found herself questioning every sound from the forest, every creak of the cabin's aging timbers. As evening approached, she made a decision that would have seemed paranoid just a week earlier. She loaded her grandfather's old hunting rifle and placed it beside the front door, then checked the locks on all the windows before settling down to continue her research. The photograph of Agent Henshaw stared back at her from the table, his circled face a reminder that some secrets were marked for special attention by people who had the resources and motivation to keep them buried. But Bonnie Walsh had spent 40 years learning the mountain's secrets, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by people who thought they could hide their activities in her backyard. If they wanted to play games of surveillance and intimidation, they would discover that mountain people had their own ways of watching and waiting. The question was whether she could uncover the truth before the people responsible for the bunker decided that she knew too much to be allowed to continue her investigation. Tuesday's return trip to the bunker was motivated by a discovery that had kept Bonnie awake most of the night. Hidden in Patricia's collection of materials was a reference to a joint federal local operation called Project Clearwater, a name that appeared nowhere in the official documentation but was mentioned in a single letter to the editor that had been published in the Herald's opinion section and then quickly retracted. The letter, written by someone identified only as A concerned citizen, had questioned the sudden disappearance of 3 families from the area and suggested that federal authorities were involved in relocating people without proper documentation. The retraction, published a week later, claimed the letter was based on unfounded rumors and apologized for any distress caused to the families mentioned. But those families, the Kowalskis, the Hendersons and the Santos, had indeed vanished from town records after 1993, leaving behind properties that were quickly sold through estate sales and businesses that closed without explanation. Bonnie remembered now that she'd known some of these people, had seen them at Henderson's General Store and the annual Harvest Festival. Their absence from her memory wasn't due to time passing. It was because they'd been carefully erased from the community's consciousness. This time, Rex refused to approach the bunker at all, taking up a sentinel position at the edge of the clearing where he could watch both the hidden entrance and the forest paths that led back to safety. His reluctance had become absolute, and Bonnie didn't blame him. The place felt different now that she understood it was part of an active operation rather than an abandoned relic. Inside the concrete chamber, she went directly to the filing cabinets with a more systematic approach. The bottom drawer of the largest cabinet had a false back that she'd missed during her first exploration. Behind it, she found a leather-bound journal that someone had hidden with particular care. The journal's pages were filled with handwritten entries dating from March through September of 1993. The writing was precise and analytical, the work of someone accustomed to keeping detailed records. As Bonnie read by flashlight, the scope of Project Clearwater began to reveal itself in terms that chilled her to the bone. March 15th. Henderson family confirmed as suitable for relocation. Father's gambling debts provide necessary leverage for cooperation. Children ages 8 and 12 will require careful handling during transition. April 3rd, Santos relocation proceeding on schedule. Mother's immigration status irregularities discovered through surveillance provide excellent compliance motivation. No resistance anticipated. May 18th, Kowalski situation complicated by father's military background. Recommend expedited processing to minimize security risks. Unit 7 reports suspicious activity from subject's army contacts. Page after page detailed the systematic identification, surveillance, and relocation of families who appeared to have been selected based on vulnerabilities that could be exploited to ensure their cooperation. But relocated to where? And why was such an elaborate operation necessary for what appeared to be voluntary departures? The answer came in the journal's final entries. Written in September of 1993, the handwriting became less controlled, the observations more personal and disturbing. September 12th, project parameters exceeded acceptable boundaries. Recommended suspension of current protocols ignored by federal oversight. Local team expressing concerns about permanent solutions being implemented without proper authorization. September 20th, Henshaw meeting with federal contacts resulted in immediate cease order. All local operations to be terminated within 72 hours. Site to be sealed and abandoned. Personnel sworn to permanent silence under national security provisions. September 23rd, final entry. Cannot in good conscience participate further. Equipment to be left operational for monitoring purposes, but active phase terminated. God help us all for what we allowed to happen here. The journal's final page contained a list of names that made Bonnie's hands shake as she read them. The 3 families that had been relocated were listed alongside dates and a single word that appeared beside each entry. Terminated. Not relocated. Terminated. Bonnie sat back in the metal chair, the journal trembling in her hands as the full horror of what she'd discovered settled over her. These weren't voluntary relocations or witness protection programs. They were executions carried out under the cover of a federal operation and concealed through systematic elimination of evidence. The families she remembered from her early years in the mountains, families with children who had played in the same woods where she now walked Rex, had been murdered by the very people sworn to protect them. And the entire operation had been documented, recorded, and filed away in this hidden bunker, like evidence in a case that would never come to trial. But who had written the journal? The handwriting didn't match any of the official documents, and the tone suggested someone who had been present for the operations but increasingly uncomfortable with their escalation. Someone with a conscience who had tried to object to what was happening. Her answer came from a manila envelope wedged behind the false panel. Inside, she found a federal identification card for Special Agent Robert Henshaw, the man whose face had been circled in red ink in the photograph. But the card wasn't just identification. Clipped to it was a handwritten note in the same script as the journal entries. "If you are reading this, then someone has discovered what we did here. I tried to stop it, but by the time I understood the true scope of the operation, it was too late to save the families who had already been processed. The equipment is still active because they're still out there, the people who ordered these killings. They monitor these frequencies to ensure that witnesses like me remain silent. If you want to survive your discovery, trust no one in official positions. The conspiracy includes federal agents, local law enforcement, and civilian authorities. My death was not suicide regardless of how it appeared. R. Henshaw, September 1993. Bonnie read the note 3 times before its implications fully registered. Agent Henshaw had been trying to expose the operation, not lead it. His presence in the official photograph now made sense. He'd been documenting evidence of crimes being committed under federal authority, not coordinating them, and if his note was accurate, then the people responsible for the murders were still active, still monitoring the radio frequencies, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. The young reporter who had died in a car accident. Agent Henshaw's supposed suicide. How many other people had discovered pieces of this puzzle and paid with their lives? The radio equipment suddenly seemed less like abandoned technology and more like a spider's web, waiting to detect any vibration that might indicate someone was getting too close to the truth. As if summoned by her thoughts, one of the units crackled to life again. Base to Unit 7. Unusual activity detected at Site C. Investigate and report. Unit 7. The designation had appeared in the journal entries, always in connection with surveillance and monitoring activities. Someone was still out there, still watching, still reporting to whoever had taken over the operation after Agent Henshaw's death. Bonnie gathered the journal and identification card, her hands moving quickly as the enormity of her situation became clear. She'd stumbled into a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives, and her discovery of the bunker had almost certainly been detected by whatever monitoring systems were still in place. As she prepared to leave the chamber, the radio crackled again. Unit 7 to base. Subject has been inside Site C for 37 minutes. Recommend immediate intervention. The voice was local, familiar in the way that small-town voices carried distinctive patterns and inflections. Someone she might have passed on the street. Someone who had been watching her movements and reporting them to coordinators who had proven their willingness to kill. Bonnie turned off her flashlight and moved toward the entrance in darkness, guided by the faint rectangle of daylight that marked the door. Rex's anxious whining reached her from the clearing, and she could see his silhouette pacing back and forth as if he sensed approaching danger. She emerged from the bunker into morning sunlight that felt like salvation, but the feeling was short-lived. Rex's attention was fixed on the tree line beyond the clearing, his posture rigid with the focused intensity he displayed when tracking dangerous game. Someone was out there, watching, reporting, and probably coordinating her elimination, just as they had eliminated Agent Henshaw and the young reporter and anyone else who had gotten too close to the truth about Project Clearwater. The mountain that had been her sanctuary for 40 years had become a hunting ground, and Bonnie Walsh was now the prey. The medical records that Bonnie discovered in a concealed compartment beneath the bunker's main filing cabinet told a story so systematic and thorough that it took her breath away. Death certificates for all 3 families, signed by Dr. Marcus Webb and notarized by County Coroner Carl Winters, documented causes of death that read like a catalogue of convenient accidents and sudden illnesses. James Henderson, heart attack, age 34, no autopsy performed. Maria Santos, car accident, single vehicle rollover. No witnesses. Paul Kowalski, hunting accident, accidental discharge of firearm. The children's deaths were listed as complications from the same incidents that had claimed their parents. Maria Santos's 8-year-old daughter had allegedly died from injuries sustained in the same car accident, while the Henderson and Kowalski children had succumbed to various medical emergencies that coincidentally occurred within days of their parents' deaths. But it was the medical examiner's notes, handwritten in margins and on separate sheets of paper, that revealed the true horror of what had been done. Dr. Webb had documented evidence that contradicted every official cause of death: bullet wounds that didn't match hunting accidents, trauma patterns inconsistent with vehicle crashes, and toxicology results that had been deliberately omitted from the final reports. Patient exhibits defensive wounds on hands and forearms consistent with struggle, read one note. It clipped to James Henderson's file. Gunshot wound trajectory incompatible with stated circumstances. Recommend further investigation. But that recommendation had been crossed out in red ink, replaced with a notation that read, "Case closed per federal directive." Each family's medical records contained similar discrepancies, evidence of violence that had been systematically documented and then officially ignored. Dr. Webb had been thorough in his examinations, recording details that painted a clear picture of multiple homicides disguised as accidents and natural deaths. Bonnie found herself sitting on the cold concrete floor of the bunker, surrounded by evidence of murders that had been committed 30 years ago and covered up by the very people the community had trusted to protect them. The weight of the truth was overwhelming, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because of how completely they had been erased from collective memory. She remembered now that she had attended funeral services for some of these families. The community had rallied around the tragic losses, bringing casseroles and flowers, offering comfort to survivors who hadn't actually survived at all. The entire town had been manipulated into mourning fictional accidents, while the real victims lay buried in graves that held secrets instead of peace. But where were the actual burial sites? The funeral home records showed that all 3 families had been cremated, an unusual choice for a community where traditional burial was the norm. The cremations had been expedited, completed within 48 hours of death, with the ashes reportedly scattered in locations chosen by surviving relatives who didn't exist, which meant the bodies had been disposed of in ways that eliminated any possibility of future examination or investigation. The murders hadn't just been committed, they'd been planned with the kind of thoroughness that suggested professional expertise in covering up violent crimes. Bonnie's hands shook as she photographed each document with her phone, building a digital archive of evidence that might be the only proof these families had ever existed. The systematic nature of the cover-up suggested that other evidence had been deliberately destroyed, leaving the bunker's files as the sole record of what had actually happened. As she worked, a sound from outside made her freeze. Rex was barking again, but this time his alarm was sustained and urgent, the kind of warning he gave when strangers approached their territory. Bonnie turned off her phone's camera and listened carefully, trying to determine how much immediate danger she faced. Footsteps, deliberate and careful, but not cautious enough to avoid detection by a dog whose hearing had been sharpened by years of mountain living. Someone was approaching the bunker, and they were trying to move quietly through terrain that made stealth nearly impossible. Bonnie gathered the most critical documents and stuffed them into her jacket, then moved toward the back wall of the chamber, where shadows offered the best concealment. If whoever was coming intended to trap her in the bunker, she needed to understand their intentions before deciding whether to attempt an escape or try to remain hidden. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance. Rex's barking had ceased, replaced by a low growling that meant he was in defensive position, ready to attack or flee depending on how the situation developed. Bonnie held her breath and waited. "Mrs. Walsh." The voice was elderly, tentative, and distinctly local. "I know you're in there. I saw you go in, and I need to talk to you before it's too late." The accent was pure mountain, aged and weathered like seasoned timber. Whoever was speaking had lived in these hills for decades, long enough to develop the distinctive cadence that marked lifelong residents. But that didn't mean they were safe. Local people had been part of the conspiracy from the beginning. "My name is Jimmy Kowalski. Paul was my older brother." The name hit Bonnie like a physical blow. According to the medical records, Paul Kowalski had died in a hunting accident in September of 1993. If this man was telling the truth, then she was speaking to a survivor, someone who had lost family to the Project Clearwater murders and might have answers to questions she didn't even know how to ask. "I've been waiting 30 years for someone to find this place," the voice continued. "Waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to open that door and see what we did here. We, not they." Jimmy Kowalski had been involved in whatever happened to his own brother's family. The implications of that revelation made Bonnie's stomach turn. But she forced herself to remain calm and assess the situation rationally. "I'm coming out," she called, making sure her voice carried the confidence she didn't feel. "But my dog is protective, and I'm armed." The last part was a lie. Her rifle was back at the cabin, but Jimmy Kowalski didn't need to know that. If he intended her harm, a little misdirection might buy her time to escape, or at least make him reconsider his approach. Bonnie emerged from the bunker to find an elderly man standing 20 feet away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. He was thin and weathered, probably in his 70s, with the kind of deep tan that came from decades of outdoor work. Rex stood between them, hackles raised but not advancing, reading the man's body language for signs of threat. "I didn't have a choice," Jimmy said, his voice breaking with emotion that seemed genuine. "They said if I didn't help them, they'd kill my wife and kids too. So I dug the graves and kept my mouth shut for 30 years. The confession hung between them like a challenge, forcing Bonnie to decide whether she was talking to a victim or a perpetrator. The distinction mattered. One might offer help in exposing the truth, while the other might be laying a trap designed to silence her permanently. "Tell me what happened to your brother," Bonnie said, keeping her distance but allowing conversation to continue. Jimmy's face crumpled with grief that had been carefully hidden for 3 decades. "They made me watch," he whispered. "Said I needed to understand what happened to people who didn't cooperate with federal investigations. Paul tried to fight them. He was a good soldier, trained for combat. But there were 4 of them, and they had his kids." The old man sank onto a fallen log, suddenly looking every day of his 70-plus years. "They killed the children first, made Paul and his wife watch, then finished the job. Professional work, quick and clean. Then they handed me a shovel and told me where to dig." Bonnie felt sick, but she forced herself to ask the crucial question. "Where did you bury them?" Jimmy pointed toward a section of forest that Bonnie had hiked dozens of times over the years. "Quarter-mile that way, near the old lightning strike oak. 3 graves, unmarked but not unmarked if you know what to look for. I carved small symbols in nearby trees, nothing obvious, but something that would help me remember where they rest." The revelation that she had been walking past murder victims for decades made the mountain feel alien and dangerous in ways she'd never imagined. But Jimmy's willingness to reveal the burial sites suggested either genuine remorse or an elaborate setup designed to lead her into an ambush. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because they're getting old and they're getting sloppy," Jimmy replied. "Because new people are asking questions and the radio traffic has picked up again. Because I'm dying of cancer and I won't go to my grave carrying their secrets." He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, producing a small notebook that looked like it had been handled frequently over many years. "I kept records too. Names, dates, places. Everything I could remember about who was involved and how they did it. I always thought someday there might be a reckoning." The notebook was worn leather, its pages filled with handwritten entries that appeared to span decades. Jimmy held it out to her like an offering, his hands trembling with age or emotion or both. "They're still out there," he said. "The ones who gave the orders, the ones who coordinated the cover-up." They think they're safe because enough time has passed and enough witnesses have died. But they're wrong. Bonnie took the notebook, its weight seeming disproportionate to its physical size. Inside, she found names she recognized, current and former officials, business leaders, people she saw around town and had never suspected of involvement in anything more sinister than local politics. "How many others know about this?" she asked. "Fewer every year," Jimmy replied. "Most of the people who participated are dead now. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents that probably weren't accidents. The ones still alive are the ones who gave orders instead of digging graves." As if summoned by their conversation, the radio equipment in the bunker crackled to life again. This time the transmission was clear and urgent. "All units, we have a security breach at Site C, female subject with local assistance. Recommend immediate containment protocol." Jimmy's face went pale. "They know you're here. They know I'm talking to you. We need to leave this place right now, before they send someone to clean up the mess we're making." The old man stood with surprising agility for someone his age, urgency overriding the physical limitations that had seemed to burden him moments before. "Your truck, where did you park it?" "The old logging road, about a quarter-mile south," Bonnie replied, Rex moving to her side as if sensing the need for immediate departure. Too obvious. "They'll have it covered by now." Jimmy pointed toward a section of forest that looked impenetrable to Bonnie's eyes. "There's an old mining road through there, connects to Route 9, about 3 miles down the mountain. If we move fast and stay quiet, we might reach it before they can position people to intercept us." The choice was stark and immediate. Trust a man who had confessed to being part of a murder conspiracy, or face whatever containment protocol the voices on the radio had in mind for security breaches. Neither option offered much hope for survival, but Jimmy Kowalski had just handed her 30 years of evidence that might finally bring justice to 3 murdered families. And sometimes, in the mountains, as in life, you had to choose the devil you could see over the one that remained hidden in the shadows. The abandoned mining road that Jimmy led them through was barely visible beneath 30 years of forest reclamation, but it provided cover from the main trails where their pursuers would expect them to travel. Rex moved ahead of them, his natural hunting instincts adapted to detecting human threats rather than wild game. Every few minutes he would stop and listen, his ears rotating like radar dishes to catch sounds that escaped human perception. Jimmy moved through the forest with the confidence of someone who had spent decades learning its secrets for darker purposes than recreation. He knew where the ground was solid enough to move quietly, which routes avoided clearings where they might be visible from above, and how to navigate by landmarks that were invisible to casual observers. "They use drones now," he said quietly, as they paused behind a massive fallen oak. "Started about 5 years ago, when that reporter got too close to the truth. Thermal imaging, motion detection, the whole high-tech arsenal. That's how they knew you'd been visiting the bunker." The revelation that they were being tracked by surveillance technology made the forest feel exposed and vulnerable. Bonnie found herself looking up through the canopy, searching for mechanical sounds that might indicate airborne watchers documenting their escape route. "How do you know about their methods?" she asked. Jimmy's expression grew darker. "Because they never really let me go. Once you're part of something like this, you're part of it forever. They've used me as a local asset for 30 years, watching, listening, reporting on anything unusual in the community. I'm what they call a passive monitor. Someone who looks like a harmless old-timer, but actually functions as an early warning system." The confession explained how their activities at the bunker had been detected so quickly. Jimmy had been reporting on her movements, possibly for weeks, before her discovery of the hidden entrance. But his decision to help her now suggested either a genuine change of heart or an elaborate trap that she was walking into willingly. "Why should I trust you?" Bonnie asked directly. "Because I'm dying," Jimmy replied, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had accepted an unpleasant reality. "Pancreatic cancer diagnosed 6 months ago. 6 weeks to live, maybe 8 if I'm unlucky. After 30 years of keeping their secrets, I'd like to spend my last days trying to make amends. They reached the remnants of an old mining camp, concrete foundations, and rusted equipment that had been abandoned when the coal seams played out in the 1970s. Jimmy led them to a structure that had once been an equipment shed, its corrugated metal walls providing shelter from both weather and observation. Inside the shed, Jimmy revealed why he had brought them to this particular location. Hidden beneath a carefully concealed floor panel was a cache of documents, photographs, and recording equipment that represented 3 decades of secret documentation. I learned from Agent Henshaw's mistake, Jimmy explained, as he opened weatherproof containers filled with evidence. He tried to work within the system, tried to report crimes through official channels. They killed him for it and made it look like suicide. So I decided to build my own case, gathering evidence slowly and carefully, waiting for the right moment to use it. The materials Jimmy had collected were extensive and damning. Photographs of midnight meetings between local officials and unidentified federal agents. Audio recordings of conversations that revealed the ongoing nature of the conspiracy. Financial records showing payments from shell companies to local bank accounts. Names, dates, and locations that connected. Current crimes to the original Project Clearwater murders. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled Current Operations that contained surveillance. Reports on recent activities in the area. The conspiracy hadn't ended with the 1993 murders. It had evolved into an ongoing criminal enterprise that used the remote mountain location for activities that required complete secrecy and ruthless enforcement of silence, drug trafficking. Jimmy explained as Bonnie studied shipping manifests and distribution maps. They used the old mining roads and federal forest access to move product from Mexican suppliers to East Coast markets. The original murders were about eliminating witnesses, but the operation grew into something much larger and more profitable. The documents showed a sophisticated network that had operated for decades, protected by the same combination of official corruption and violent intimidation that had concealed the original crimes. Local law enforcement, federal agents, and civilian officials had been systematically compromised through bribery, blackmail, or threats that made cooperation seem like the only viable option for survival. Tom Bradley Jr. took over from his father, Jimmy said, pointing to surveillance photos that showed the current sheriff meeting with known criminals. Same corruption, new generation. They recruit young agents and officials, get them involved in small compromises, then escalate the stakes until backing out becomes impossible. Bonnie realized that her discovery of the bunker had threatened an operation worth millions of dollars and protected by people who had already proven their willingness to commit murder. The radio transmissions she'd overheard weren't just about monitoring. They were coordinating an active criminal enterprise that treated killing as a routine business expense. Patricia Vance has been asking questions too, Jimmy continued, producing a surveillance report that made Bonnie's heart sink. They've been monitoring her research into local history, her conversations with visitors, her access to archived materials. She's on their list. The surveillance report on Patricia was detailed and threatening. Photos of her daily routines, transcripts of phone conversations, and assessments of her potential to cause problems for the operation. The same kind of documentation that had preceded the murders of the 3 families in 1993. We have to warn her, Bonnie said. Warning her won't be enough, Jimmy replied grimly. They've moved beyond warnings. The decision has been made to eliminate current threats before they can expose the operation. That includes you, Patricia, and anyone else who might have pieces of the puzzle. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of engines reached them through the forest, multiple vehicles moving slowly along the main road, probably coordinating a search pattern designed to locate their position. Rex's posture became rigid with alertness, his nose working to identify scents carried on the wind. We need to get to Patricia before they do, Bonnie said, gathering the most critical documents from Jimmy's cache. She's not at the library, Jimmy said, checking his watch. Tuesday afternoons she volunteers at the senior center, helps elderly residents with paperwork and government forms. They know her schedule better than she does. The senior center was located in the heart of town, surrounded by businesses and residential areas that would make any rescue attempt highly visible to both civilians and the people hunting them. But it also meant that Patricia was surrounded by witnesses, people who might ask questions if she disappeared or had an accident in broad daylight. How do we reach her without walking into a trap? Bonnie asked. Jimmy smiled grimly, pulling out a radio that looked like the equipment they'd seen in the bunker. We use their own communications against them. I've been monitoring their frequencies for years, learning their procedures and code words. Time to put that knowledge to work. He activated the radio and began scanning frequencies, searching for the coordination chatter that would reveal the positions and intentions of the people hunting them. After several minutes, he found what he was looking for: voices discussing the deployment of assets around potential target locations. Unit 3 is positioned at the library. Unit 5 has the senior center under observation. Unit 7 is coordinating with local assets for road closures on routes 9 and 15. The scale of the operation was overwhelming. They weren't dealing with a few corrupt officials trying to cover up old crimes. They were facing a well-funded, professionally organized criminal network with resources that included multiple teams of trained operatives and the cooperation of local law enforcement. How many people are involved in this? Bonnie asked. More than you'd think, fewer than they want us to believe, Jimmy replied. The core group is maybe 8 or 10 people, but they've cultivated a network of passive collaborators who provide information and assistance without understanding the full scope of what they're supporting. He pointed to names on a list that included local business owners, county officials, and federal employees who had been compromised through various forms of coercion. Most of these people think they're helping with legitimate law enforcement activities or national security operations. They don't know about the murders or the drug trafficking. The radio crackled again, this time with a transmission that made both of them freeze. Base to all units. Priority target is female, approximately 60 years old, accompanied by elderly male and large dog. Last seen moving southeast from Site C. Orders are to detain for questioning and eliminate if resistance is encountered. Detain for questioning. The euphemism didn't fool either of them. They had seen the results of Project Clearwater's questioning techniques documented in the medical examiner's reports. We're running out of time, Jimmy said, gathering equipment and preparing to move. If we're going to save Patricia and expose this operation, we need to act now, before they can consolidate their positions and eliminate all the witnesses. But as they prepared to leave the abandoned mining shed, Bonnie realized that their situation had moved beyond simple survival. They were now the only people with complete knowledge of a criminal conspiracy that had operated successfully for 30 years. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it was also liberating. For the first time in her adult life, Bonnie Walsh knew exactly what she had to do, even if doing it meant confronting dangers that could cost her everything she'd built in these mountains she called home. The federal badge that Jimmy pulled from the deepest compartment of his evidence cache wasn't old or corroded like the documents they'd been examining. The identification card was current, issued just 2 years ago to Special Agent Maria Santos, the same Maria Santos who had supposedly died in a car accident with her 8-year-old daughter in 1993. Bonnie stared at the badge, her mind struggling to process the implications. This can't be right. Maria Santos died 30 years ago. I saw her death certificate. Maria Santos, the wife and mother, died 30 years ago, Jimmy said quietly. But Maria Santos, the federal agent, has been alive and working under deep cover ever since. She was never a victim. She was the federal coordinator for Project Clearwater. The revelation hit Bonnie like a physical blow. Everything she thought she understood about the conspiracy had been turned upside down. The woman she'd believed was a murder victim had actually been the federal agent responsible for coordinating the murders of her own supposed family. The car accident was staged, Jimmy continued, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets he'd carried for 3 decades. Her husband and daughter were real victims, but Maria survived and was given a new identity within the Federal Witness Protection Program. Except she wasn't being protected from criminals. She was being protected from prosecution for her role in the killings. The documents that accompanied the badge told a story that was even more disturbing than the original conspiracy. Maria Santos had been an undercover federal agent investigating organized crime connections in rural West Virginia. Her marriage to Carlos Santos and their daughter Eleanor had been genuine, but her mission was to infiltrate criminal networks using her family as cover for extended surveillance operations. When the organized crime families discovered her true identity, they had demanded that federal authorities eliminate her or face retaliation against other undercover operations nationwide. Rather than extract her safely, her federal handlers had chosen to fake her death and use the incident to test new protocols for deep cover asset protection. The other families, the Hendersons and Kowalskis, they were real witnesses who had discovered evidence of federal corruption, Jimmy explained. With D to C, Sage had done. Maria's handlers decided to eliminate them at the same time, making it look like a coordinated attack on multiple federal assets rather than the murder of inconvenient witnesses. The medical examiner's notes that Bonnie had found now made terrible sense. Dr. Webb had documented evidence of murders, but he'd been told the killings were necessary to protect federal operations. The systematic cover-up hadn't been local corruption, it had been federal policy, implemented through a network of compromised officials who believed they were protecting national security. Agent Henshaw tried to expose what was happening, Jimmy continued. He realized that Project Clearwater had become a testing ground for assassination techniques and witness elimination protocols that violated every constitutional protection he'd sworn to uphold. When he threatened to go public, they killed him and made it look like suicide. But the most shocking revelation was contained in the communications logs that Jimmy had intercepted over the years. Maria Santos hadn't disappeared after her staged death. She had been promoted within the federal law enforcement hierarchy, eventually becoming the regional coordinator for operations that used the same techniques that had been tested in their mountain community. She's been back here several times over the years, Jimmy said, producing surveillance photos that showed a woman in her 50s visiting the bunker site and meeting with local contacts. Always under different identities, always coordinating new operations that require the same kind of permanent silence that Project Clearwater provided. The photos were damning evidence that the conspiracy hadn't ended in 1993. It had become institutionalized as a federal program for eliminating witnesses and protecting assets through methods that included systematic murder of American citizens. The drug trafficking operation is just the latest iteration, Jimmy explained. They use the remote location and established infrastructure to test new techniques for moving contraband, laundering money, and eliminating potential witnesses. Each operation provides training and experience for federal agents who might need to use similar methods in other locations. Bonnie realized that their mountain community hadn't just been the victim of criminal conspiracy. It had been converted into a training ground for federal assassins, a place where techniques for murdering American citizens could be refined and perfected away from public scrutiny. The radio equipment in the bunker suddenly took on new significance. It wasn't just communication gear, it was part of a federal surveillance network that monitored operations across multiple states, coordinating activities that included systematic violation of civil rights and constitutional protections. How many other communities are being used this way? Bonnie asked. According to the communications I have intercepted, at least a dozen, Jimmy replied. Rural areas where federal agents can operate without oversight, where local officials can be compromised or eliminated. where entire populations can be controlled through fear and intimidation. The scope of the conspiracy was beyond anything Bonnie had imagined. They weren't dealing with a local criminal enterprise. They were confronting a shadow government program that had been operating for decades, protected by federal authority and funded through criminal activities that generated billions of dollars in untraceable revenue. But the most immediate threat was the revelation that Maria Santos was currently in the area, coordinating the response to Bonnie's discovery of the bunker. The federal badge was accompanied by travel documents, showing her arrival at the regional airport just 2 days ago, the same day. Bonnie had first opened the steel door. She's been monitoring the situation through the surveillance network, Jimmy said. The radio transmissions we've been hearing aren't coming from local assets. They're coming from federal coordination, teams that specialize in witness elimination and evidence destruction. The young reporter who had died in a car accident 5 years ago hadn't been killed by local conspirators. He'd been eliminated by federal agents using techniques that had been perfected through 30 years of operations in their community. His death had been a training exercise, an opportunity for new agents to practice assassination methods under the supervision of experienced killers like Maria Santos. We're not just fighting corruption, Bonnie realized. We're fighting the federal government itself. Part of it, Jimmy corrected. The part that operates outside constitutional oversight, that treats American citizens as acceptable, casualties in operations that were never authorized by Congress or reviewed by courts. The evidence they had gathered suddenly seemed inadequate against an adversary with federal resources and legal authority. Local law enforcement couldn't be trusted because they were either compromised or outranked by federal agents. State authorities would defer to federal jurisdiction. Even congressional oversight committees could be infiltrated or misled by people who had spent decades perfecting techniques for manipulating official investigations. But Jimmy had one more revelation that changed everything about their situation. Maria Santos isn't the only federal agent working under assumed identity in this operation, he said, producing a file that made Bonnie's hand shake as she opened it. The current sheriff, Tom Bradley Jr., isn't just the son of a corrupt local official. He's a federal agent who was inserted into the position to provide ongoing coordination for operations that require local law enforcement cooperation. The federal documents confirmed that Thomas Bradley Jr. had graduated from the FBI Academy and worked in federal law enforcement for 8 years before being assigned to deep cover rural coordination in West Virginia. His appointment as sheriff hadn't been the result of local politics. It had been a federal personnel assignment designed to ensure continued control over the law enforcement apparatus that protected their operations. How many other officials are federal plants? Bonnie asked. We're about to find out, Jimmy replied, activating the radio equipment he'd brought from his cache. Because Maria Santos just issued orders for a complete security sweep of the area. Every official, every business owner, every citizen who might have information about our activities is about to be contacted and questioned. The radio crackled with transmissions that revealed the scope of the operation being deployed against them. Multiple federal teams were coordinating with local assets to implement what they called comprehensive threat neutralization, a euphemism that Jimmy's experience told him meant the systematic elimination of anyone who might have knowledge of their activities. They're going to kill everyone, Bonnie said, the reality of their situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Everyone who represents a potential security risk, Jimmy confirmed. Patricia, because she's been researching local history. The elderly residents at the senior center, because they might remember details from the 1990s. Business owners who might have noticed unusual activities. Anyone who could potentially provide testimony about federal crimes committed in this community. The scope of the planned massacre was staggering. Not just the elimination of a few witnesses, but the systematic murder of dozens of people whose only crime was living in a community. that had been selected as a testing ground for federal assassination programs. But as Bonnie processed the enormity of what they were facing, she realized that Jimmy's 30 years of documentation had provided them with one crucial advantage. They knew the identities, methods, and current locations of the people responsible for the conspiracy. For the first time in 3 decades, the Watchers had become the Watched. "We can't stop them from implementing their security sweep," Jimmy said, "but we can make sure that evidence of their crimes survives their attempt to eliminate all the witnesses." The question was whether they could get that evidence to people who had both the authority and the courage to act on it before Maria Santos and her federal assassination teams completed their mission of turning their peaceful mountain community into another successful training exercise for government-sponsored murder. The detailed hit list that Jimmy retrieved from his deepest cache was printed on federal letterhead and marked with classifications that indicated its origin within the highest levels of the shadow program they'd uncovered. 23 names, including Bonnie Walsh, Patricia Vance, and Jimmy Kowalski himself, each marked with a timeline for elimination and specific methods to be employed. Patricia Vance was scheduled for vehicular accident within the next 6 hours. Bonnie Walsh was marked for home invasion robbery gone wrong that evening. Jimmy Kowalski's death would be attributed to complications from existing medical condition, a particularly cruel touch given his terminal cancer diagnosis. But the list included names that shocked Bonnie with their scope and apparent randomness. Henderson's general store owner, Martha Collins, was marked for elimination because she maintains extensive informal networks that could facilitate information sharing. The senior center's director, Frank Morrison, no relation to the former mayor, was targeted because his access to elderly residents creates potential for historical testimony coordination. They're planning to eliminate anyone who could potentially piece together fragments of information, Jimmy explained as Bonnie studied the list with growing horror. Not just people who know about the conspiracy, but people who might be able to help others understand what they'd discovered. The timeline was aggressive and coordinated. All 23 eliminations were scheduled to occur within a 72-hour window, using methods that would appear unrelated to casual observation. Heart attacks, accidents, suicides, home invasions, and medical emergencies. A catalogue of misfortune that would devastate the community, while appearing to be nothing more than a tragic coincidence of unrelated deaths. How do we warn 23 people without triggering the security protocols that would accelerate their timeline? Bonnie asked. "We don't," Jimmy replied grimly. "Warning them would only ensure they die faster and probably take us with them. The only way to save these people is to expose the entire operation publicly, with evidence so comprehensive that federal authorities can't ignore it or cover it up. But the evidence they'd gathered, while extensive, was still vulnerable to the same techniques that had concealed federal crimes for 30 years. Document authenticity could be challenged, witnesses could be discredited or eliminated, and media attention could be diverted or suppressed through channels that had proven effective in the past. We need something more than documents, Bonnie realized. We need the people responsible to expose themselves through their own actions. Jimmy smiled grimly and activated the sophisticated radio equipment he'd assembled from components stolen over 3 decades of covert monitoring. Then we're going to give them an opportunity to do exactly that. The plan that Jimmy outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. They would use the Federal Communications Network against itself, broadcasting false information designed to trigger responses that would expose the scope and nature of the conspiracy to monitoring agencies that weren't part of the shadow program. The NSA monitors all federal law enforcement communications, Jimmy explained as he fine-tuned the radio equipment. But they don't usually analyze the content unless specific keywords or threat indicators are detected. We're going to give them those indicators. The false emergency that Jimmy proposed would report a terrorist cell operating in their area, using code words and frequencies that would automatically trigger NSA attention and potentially FBI counterterrorism investigation. The shadow program's response to this false threat would reveal their illegal activities to federal agencies that had legitimate oversight authority. But that means we'll be falsely reporting terrorist activity, Bonnie protested. That's a federal crime that could send us to prison for decades. We're already marked for execution, Jimmy pointed out. Prison would be an improvement over the alternatives they have planned for us. The radio crackled as Jimmy began implementing their desperate gambit, transmitting carefully crafted messages designed to mimic the communication patterns of actual terrorist organizations. Within minutes, automated systems began responding with queries and coordination requests that confirmed their transmissions were being intercepted and analyzed by multiple federal agencies. But the shadow program's response was immediate and revealed the depth of their infiltration into legitimate federal operations. Instead of triggering investigation of terrorist activity, their transmissions were being intercepted and redirected through channels that prevented outside agencies from receiving the intelligence that should have prompted immediate response. They've compromised the monitoring systems, Jimmy said, his face pale with the realization that their plan had failed. Maria Santos and her people have access to NSA and FBI communications networks. They're filtering out anything that might expose their operations. The sophistication of the corruption was staggering. The shadow program hadn't just infiltrated local law enforcement, they had systematically compromised federal oversight mechanisms, ensuring that their activities remained invisible to the very agencies that should have been monitoring them. But Jimmy's decades of surveillance had prepared him for this possibility. Hidden within his equipment cache was a communication system that bypassed federal networks entirely, connecting directly to international monitoring stations that couldn't be controlled or manipulated by American agencies. During the Cold War, European intelligence services established monitoring stations to track American military communications. Jimmy explained as he assembled components that looked more like amateur radio equipment than sophisticated surveillance gear. Those stations are still operational, still monitoring, and they're not subject to American intelligence oversight. The plan that emerged from this revelation was even more dangerous than their original gambit. They would broadcast evidence of federal crimes directly to foreign intelligence services, using protocols that Jimmy had learned during his military service in communications intelligence. The risk was enormous. Contacting foreign agents with classified information was treason by any legal definition, but it was also their only option for exposing crimes that had been systematically concealed from American oversight. The British have a monitoring station in Cyprus that intercepts American communications in this frequency range, Jimmy explained as he calibrated the equipment. If we can get their attention with the right combination of keywords and authentication codes, they'll be required to share intelligence about American domestic crimes with congressional oversight committees. The international implications of their plan were staggering. Evidence of systematic federal assassination programs would create diplomatic incidents that couldn't be suppressed through normal channels. Foreign governments would demand explanations, congressional hearings would be mandatory, and media attention would be impossible to control or redirect. But as they prepared to implement their desperate strategy, the radio equipment they'd been monitoring suddenly exploded with activity that made both of them freeze in terror. All units, security breach at Site D. Subjects have accessed classified materials and are attempting external communication. Implement terminal protocol immediately. Terminal protocol. Jimmy's face went white as he recognized the code designation. They're not just planning to eliminate the people on the list, he whispered. They're planning to destroy the entire community. The transmissions that followed revealed the scope of the terminal protocol in clinical detail. A gas leak explosion at the senior center would eliminate elderly residents who might have historical knowledge. An electrical fire at Henderson's General Store would destroy a community gathering place and its owner. Multiple accidents would strike simultaneously, creating a disaster that would require federal emergency response and provide cover for eliminating any remaining witnesses. "How many people live in this community?" Bonnie asked, her voice barely audible. "About 400 year-round residents," Jimmy replied. "Plus seasonal visitors, hikers, tourists. Maybe 600 people total in the immediate area. 600 people marked for elimination to protect a shadow program that had operated in secret for 30 years. The scope of the planned massacre was beyond comprehension, but the radio traffic confirmed that federal resources were already being positioned to implement it. Emergency response teams were moving into position around the community. Hazardous materials specialists were setting up equipment near critical infrastructure. Medical evacuation helicopters were standing by at the regional airport. All the components necessary for a disaster that would appear natural, but was actually a coordinated act of mass murder. "We have maybe 2 hours before they begin implementation," Jimmy said, working frantically to complete the international communication link. "After that, nothing we do will matter, because there won't be anyone left to testify about what we discovered." But their preparation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Their location, multiple engines, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested professional search teams rather than random traffic. Rex's alert posture confirmed that their hidden position had been compromised, probably through surveillance technology that had been tracking them throughout their escape from the bunker. "They've found us," Bonnie said, gathering the most critical evidence while Jimmy continued working on the communication equipment. "Not yet," Jimmy replied, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the approaching danger. "But they will within the next few minutes. This equipment needs 30 seconds to establish connection, then another minute to transmit the data package." The vehicles were closer now, their engines audible through the forest canopy that had provided concealment. Rex moved to the entrance of their shelter, his body language indicating that multiple threats were approaching from different directions in patterns designed to prevent escape. "Can you complete the transmission while we're moving?" Bonnie asked. "Not with this equipment," Jimmy replied. "The international link requires precise positioning and uninterrupted power supply. If we move now, we lose the opportunity to expose their crimes." The choice was immediate and stark: abandon their evidence and flee, or stay and attempt to broadcast proof of federal assassination programs while facing almost certain capture by people who had spent decades perfecting techniques for eliminating witnesses. "How long do we have?" Bonnie asked. Jimmy listened to the approaching engines and calculated their probable search pattern. 3 minutes, maybe 4, if they're being cautious about approaching an unknown situation. 3 minutes to transmit evidence that could save 600 lives and expose crimes that had been concealed for 30 years. 3 minutes to choose between personal survival and the possibility of justice for victims who had been buried and forgotten. "Do it," Bonnie said, moving to the shelter's entrance, where she could watch for approaching threats while Jimmy worked on their final gambit, the communication equipment. Hummed to life as international monitoring stations responded to Jimmy's authentication codes. Data began flowing across encrypted channels that couldn't be intercepted or redirected by the shadow program's compromised networks. Names, dates, locations, photographs, audio recordings, and documentation that painted a complete picture of federal crimes spanning 3 decades. But as the transmission progressed, the sounds of their approaching capture grew closer and more coordinated. Vehicle doors slamming, radio chatter coordinating search patterns, the measured footsteps of professionals who knew how to approach dangerous situations with minimal risk to themselves. 60 seconds remaining, Jimmy reported, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Rex's low growling indicated that human figures were now visible through the forest, moving carefully but deliberately toward their position. Bonnie could see glimpses of tactical gear and military-style coordination that confirmed they were facing federal agents rather than local law enforcement. 30 seconds, Jimmy whispered, voices now close enough to understand fragments of conversation about securing the perimeter and preventing escape routes. Professional terminology that indicated extensive training in operations that required containment and elimination of targets who possessed sensitive information. 10 seconds, Jimmy said, his finger hovering over the transmission control. The first federal agent appeared at the edge of their clearing, weapon drawn and pointed toward their shelter. Behind him, more figures were moving into positions that would make escape impossible even if they had planned to attempt it. "Transmission complete," Jimmy announced, just as the first voice called out with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Federal agents, exit the structure with your hands visible and prepare for detention." But as Bonnie and Jimmy emerged from their shelter with hands raised, Rex remained inside, positioned next to equipment that was still broadcasting their location and activities to international monitoring stations. The dog's loyalty had provided them with one final advantage. Real-time evidence of their capture by federal agents would be transmitted to foreign intelligence services, creating immediate international pressure for explanations of American domestic assassination programs. "You have made a grave mistake," the lead agent said as restraints were applied. "Interfering with federal operations and communicating classified information to foreign governments are capital crimes under the Espionage Act." But Bonnie Walsh had spent 40 years learning that some mistakes were worth making, and some prices were worth paying for the chance to bring truth to light. As federal agents secured evidence and prepared to implement the terminal protocol that would eliminate their entire community, she realized that their desperate gambit had succeeded in ways they couldn't have anticipated. The Watchers had finally become the watched, and the world was now paying attention to what happened in Forgotten Mountain, communities where federal agents practiced techniques for murdering American citizens. The two-way radio transcript that federal agents discovered in Jimmy's equipment cache revealed more than they had intended to expose. As Maria Santos arrived at the detention site to personally oversee the interrogation of her prisoners, the radio continued, broadcasting their conversations to international monitoring stations that were now recording every word spoken by federal agents implementing an illegal domestic assassination program. "Shut that equipment down," Santos ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute control over operational environments. "We can't." "Ma'am," the communications specialist replied, "it's using authentication codes that we don't recognize, and the transmission protocols are hardened against standard interference techniques." The equipment that Jimmy had assembled over 30 years of covert operations was more sophisticated than Santos had anticipated. While federal agents worked to interrupt the international broadcast, everything they said and did was being transmitted to foreign intelligence services that were required by treaty obligations to share evidence of American domestic crimes with congressional oversight committees. "How long has this transmission been active?" Santos demanded. "At least 40 minutes, possibly longer," the specialist replied. "The equipment was broadcasting before we arrived, and it's continued despite our attempts to jam the frequencies." 40 minutes of recorded conversations between federal agents coordinating mass murder in an American community. 40 minutes of documentation that would be impossible to deny or suppress through normal channels. Santos realized that her carefully planned terminal protocol had become a liability that threatened to expose not just their current operation, but the entire shadow program that had operated in secret for 3 decades. "Implement immediate evacuation protocols," Santos ordered. "All personnel withdraw to secondary positions. This site is compromised, but the evacuation order came too late." The radio crackled with an incoming transmission that made everyone freeze in recognition of its implications. "This is FBI Assistant Director Catherine Morgan, broadcasting on international emergency frequencies. Federal agents operating in West Virginia are ordered to cease all activities immediately and report to designated collection points for debriefing. Congressional oversight committees have been notified of potential domestic crimes, and international monitoring stations are providing real-time surveillance of federal activities in the area. The transmission was being broadcast on multiple frequencies simultaneously, ensuring that it reached not just Santos and her team, but every federal agent operating in the region. More importantly, it was being recorded by the same international monitoring stations that had received Jimmy's evidence package, creating an official record of federal response to reports of domestic assassination programs. Santos's face was grim as she processed the implications. The shadow program that had operated without oversight for 30 years was now under active investigation by legitimate federal authorities who couldn't be intimidated or eliminated like local witnesses, ma'am. We're receiving stand-down orders from multiple federal agencies, her communications specialist reported. FBI, DEA, ATF, and DHS are all demanding immediate cessation of current operations. But Santos had spent decades implementing programs that operated outside normal federal oversight, and she wasn't prepared to abandon 30 years of work without attempting to salvage what she could from the disaster that Jimmy and Bonnie's investigation had created. Continue with modified terminal protocol, she ordered. Scale reduced to primary targets only. Make it look like local criminal activity rather than federal operations. The modified plan that Santos outlined was still staggering in its scope and brutality. Patricia Vance would be eliminated through a home invasion that would destroy her research materials. The senior center would experience a gas leak explosion that would eliminate elderly residents who might provide historical testimony. Henderson's general store would suffer an electrical fire that would destroy community records and its owner. But as Santos coordinated her reduced massacre plan, the radio equipment continued broadcasting every word to international audiences that were now coordinating with American congressional oversight committees to investigate federal crimes in real time. Ma'am, the communications specialist interrupted, his voice tight with worry. We're showing multiple aircraft approaching from the south. Military transponders indicate federal law enforcement response teams. Through the forest canopy, the sound of helicopters became audible. Not the single medical evacuation aircraft that had been positioned for the terminal protocol, but multiple aircraft carrying the kind of rapid response teams that were deployed when federal crimes required immediate investigation. Santos realized that her shadow program was facing the one threat it had never been designed to handle: oversight by legitimate federal authorities who possessed both the legal authority and the physical resources to shut down illegal operations, regardless of their classification, level, or political protection. Release the prisoners, she ordered reluctantly. Full evacuation, all personnel to extraction points. Implement evidence destruction, protocols for all classified materials. But Bonnie Walsh and Jimmy Kowalski were no longer just prisoners who could be quietly eliminated. They were witnesses whose testimony was being broadcast in real time to international audiences that included congressional oversight committees. Releasing them would provide immediate evidence of federal crimes, while continuing to hold them would constitute additional federal crimes being committed under international observation. Ma'am, the prisoners are requesting to speak with the FBI agents who are coordinating the congressional investigation, the communications specialist reported. Absolutely not, Santos replied. Transport them to secure facilities for extended debriefing under national security provisions. But the radio crackled, again with transmissions that made clear Santos no longer had the authority to make such decisions. This is Assistant Director Morgan. All personnel operating in West Virginia are ordered to secure prisoners for transfer to FBI custody immediately. Any interference with this order will be treated as obstruction of a federal investigation into domestic crimes. The approaching helicopters were now visible through breaks in the forest canopy. Federal aircraft marked with FBI and congressional oversight identifiers that indicated the highest levels of American government were now involved in investigating the shadow program that Santos had spent her career protecting. "Ma'am, we need to evacuate immediately," her senior agent advised. "If we're still here when those aircraft land, we'll be arrested along with the prisoners." Santos faced a choice that 30 years of illegal operations had never prepared her for surrender to legitimate federal authorities and face prosecution for crimes that had been sanctioned by shadow programs, or flee and spend the rest of her life as a fugitive from the very government she had served. But as she prepared to order full evacuation, Rex emerged from the equipment shelter with something in his mouth that made everyone freeze in recognition of its significance. The dog had retrieved a recording device that had been documenting their entire conversation, creating additional evidence of federal agents coordinating mass murder while under international observation. "The dog," Santos said, raising her weapon toward Rex. "Don't," Bonnie warned, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 40 years learning how mountain justice worked. "That dog is smarter than you think, and he's been trained to protect evidence." As if responding to her words, Rex moved to a position between the federal agents and the radio equipment, his posture making clear that any attempt to destroy the transmission devices would require getting past a German shepherd who had been trained to defend his territory against human threats. The sound of landing helicopters filled the forest as FBI rapid response teams deployed to secure evidence and arrest federal agents who had been operating illegal assassination programs. Santos realized that her 30-year career in shadow operations was ending in the worst possible way. Exposure, arrest, and prosecution by the very government that had originally sanctioned her crimes, but as federal agents loyal to constitutional oversight rather than shadow programs approached through the forest. Bonnie Walsh felt a sense of justice that had been 30 years in coming. The families murdered in 1993 would finally have their truth told, and the mountain community that had been selected as a testing ground for federal assassination techniques would be free from the shadow of systematic terrorism that had controlled their lives for 3 decades. The Watchers had become the watched, and the light of justice was finally penetrating shadows that had hidden federal crimes since before most Americans realized their own government was capable of such systematic evil. Maria's original testimony, preserved in Agent Henshaw's hidden files and now transmitted to international monitoring stations, contained details that would reshape understanding of federal law enforcement capabilities and constitutional violations that had been systematically concealed for 3 decades. As FBI teams secured the area and arrested Santos along with her operatives, the full scope of Project Clearwater's evolution into an ongoing assassination program became clear to congressional investigators who had never suspected such operations existed. The testimony revealed that Maria Santos had initially been an undercover agent investigating legitimate criminal activity, but had been gradually corrupted through a systematic process that compromised her loyalty and morality. Federal handlers had used her family as leverage, threatening her husband and daughter to ensure her cooperation with increasingly illegal activities. When organized crime figures discovered her identity, her handlers had chosen to eliminate her family rather than extract her safely, then used her grief and guilt to bind her to the shadow program that had murdered her loved ones. "They made me watch," Maria's recorded confession revealed. "They said I needed to understand the consequences of failure, the price of betraying federal operations. My husband Carlos tried to protect our daughter Elena, but they killed him first, made Elena watch, then finished the job while I was restrained and forced to observe." The psychological manipulation that had transformed Maria from victim to perpetrator was documented in clinical detail. Federal psychologists had used trauma bonding techniques to ensure her loyalty, convincing her that serving the shadow program was the only way to honor her. Family sacrifice and prevent similar tragedies from affecting other federal agents. But the most damning revelation was the scope of the program's expansion. Maria's testimony documented similar operations in 12 other rural communities across the United States, each serving as a training ground for federal assassination techniques and witness elimination protocols. Hundreds of American citizens had been murdered to protect operations that had no congressional oversight and no constitutional authorization. As FBI Assistant Director Morgan coordinated the arrest of shadow program operatives, the radio equipment continued broadcasting real-time evidence of federal crimes to international audiences that included European intelligence services, Canadian mounted police, and Mexican federal authorities. The international implications of systematic American domestic assassination programs created diplomatic pressure that made cover-up impossible through normal channels. The equipment is hardened against interference, FBI communications specialists reported. Shutting it down would require destroying it, which would eliminate evidence that congressional oversight committees need for their investigation. The irony was perfect. Equipment designed to conceal federal crimes was now exposing them to the world, and the sophisticated security measures that had protected the shadow program for 30 years were now preventing its destruction by legitimate federal authorities. Jimmy Kowalski's heroic decision to sacrifice his remaining weeks of life to expose the conspiracy was documented in real time as FBI medical teams assessed his condition. The cancer that was killing him had been accelerated by stress and exposure, but he remained conscious and coherent enough to provide testimony that filled gaps in the documentary evidence. I dug their graves. Jimmy confessed to FBI investigators, while international monitoring stations recorded every word. Paul Kowalski was my brother, and they made me bury him and his family in unmarked graves while Maria Santos watched and took notes for her. Psychological evaluation reports. The graves that Jimmy had maintained in secret for 30 years were located by FBI. Forensic teams within hours of his confession. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of human remains at the sites he identified, providing physical evidence that corroborated the documentary proof of systematic murder. But the most dramatic moment came when Patricia Vance arrived at the scene. Escorted by FBI agents who had extracted her from the senior center just minutes before a gas leak explosion that had been scheduled as part of Santos's modified terminal protocol. Her research materials, which federal agents had planned to destroy, contained evidence that supported and expanded on Jimmy's documentation. I knew something was wrong, Patricia told investigators while broadcast equipment transmitted her testimony internationally. Families don't just disappear the way they did in 1993. People don't have car accidents and hunting. Accidents and heart attacks all in the same month unless someone is making it happen. The community members who had been marked for elimination began arriving at the FBI command post as word spread through the mountain networks that had sustained them for generations. Martha Collins from Henderson's General Store, Frank Morrison from the Senior Center. Elderly residents who remembered details from the 1990s that federal agents had planned to eliminate, along with the people who possessed those memories. Each testimony added pieces to a puzzle that revealed the scope of federal crimes and the systematic violation of constitutional protections that had been implemented under the cover of national security operations. The mountain community that had been selected as a testing ground for assassination techniques became the source of evidence that would reshape American understanding of federal law enforcement capabilities and oversight requirements. But the most significant moment came when Rex approached the FBI evidence team carrying a metal container that he had retrieved from a location known only to him. Inside, investigators found Agent Henshaw's complete files on Project Clearwater, including recordings of federal officials authorizing murders and documentation of the command structure that had implemented 30 years of systematic assassination programs. "Good boy," Bonnie said, scratching Rex behind the ears, as FBI agents processed evidence that would send federal officials to prison for the rest of their lives. "You've been protecting those files all along, haven't you?" The dog's instinctive protection of evidence had preserved proof of federal crimes that would otherwise have been destroyed when Santos implemented her evidence destruction protocols. Rex had understood, in ways that transcended human comprehension, that the hidden files represented justice for people who had been murdered and forgotten. As helicopters evacuated, arrested federal agents and international monitoring stations continued broadcasting evidence of American domestic assassination programs. Bonnie Walsh realized that her quiet mountain existence had been forever changed by her discovery of the steel door that had concealed 30 years of federal crimes. But the change brought liberation rather than loss. For the first time since 1993, her community was free from the shadow of systematic terrorism that had controlled their lives through fear and systematic elimination of anyone who asked inconvenient questions about the people who had disappeared without explanation or investigation. 6 months after the FBI raid that exposed Project Clearwater and its evolution into a federal assassination program, the community memorial stood where the hidden bunker had been discovered. The steel door that had concealed 30 years of federal crimes now opened onto a peaceful garden where families could remember loved ones who had been murdered and forgotten by a government that was supposed to protect them. Bonnie Walsh stood before the memorial's centerpiece, a granite monument engraved with the names of Carlos and Elena Santos, James and Patricia Henderson, Paul and Anna Kowalski, and their children who had been killed to protect operations that had no constitutional authorization. Below their names, a simple inscription read, "Their truth was buried but not lost." The legal proceedings that followed the investigation had been swift and comprehensive. Maria Santos, facing life in prison for multiple counts of murder and conspiracy, had provided complete testimony about the Shadow Program's operations in exchange for a sentence that would allow her to die in federal custody rather than face execution. Her confession had led to arrests of federal officials across multiple agencies, congressional hearings that resulted in new oversight legislation, and international agreements to monitor American domestic law enforcement activities. Tom Bradley Jr., revealed to be a federal agent planted in the sheriff's position, had been arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, and violation of constitutional rights under color of federal authority. His replacement, elected by the community in a special election, was Patricia Vance, whose research and courage had been instrumental in exposing the conspiracy. "Hard to believe it's been 6 months, Patricia said, joining Bonnie at the memorial. As the new sheriff, she wore the badge with the same dedication to truth that had made her an excellent librarian, committed to serving her community, rather than federal agencies that operated outside constitutional oversight. The bunker itself had been converted into a documentation center where researchers could study the techniques that federal agencies had used to conceal domestic crimes. The radio equipment that had exposed the conspiracy continued operating under FBI supervision, monitoring federal communications for evidence of similar programs that might be operating in other communities. Jimmy Kowalski had lived long enough to see Maria Santos arrested and to provide complete testimony that resulted in the location and proper burial of his brother's family. His death, 2 weeks after the FBI raid, had been peaceful, attended by community members who honored his courage in exposing crimes that had terrorized them for 30 years. His grave, marked with a simple stone that read "Truth, Teller," lay near the memorial garden, where his brother's family finally rested in properly marked graves. The international implications of the Project Clearwater revelations continued to reverberate through diplomatic channels. European allies had demanded explanations for American domestic assassination programs. Canadian authorities had increased monitoring of cross-border federal activities, and Mexican officials had raised questions about similar operations that might have been conducted in their territory. But for Bonnie, the most significant change was the restoration of peace to her mountain sanctuary. The trails she walked with Rex were no longer monitored by surveillance equipment designed to track potential witnesses. The community gatherings at Henderson's General Store were no longer infiltrated by federal agents evaluating residents for potential elimination. The sense of safety that had been systematically destroyed through 30 years of terrorism had been restored through the simple act of exposing truth to light. "Do you ever regret opening that door?" Patricia asked as they walked the same trail where Bonnie had first discovered the hidden entrance. "Never," Bonnie replied without hesitation. "Some doors are meant to be opened, no matter what lies behind them." Rex ranged ahead of them, investigating scents and sounds with the relaxed confidence of a dog whose territory was no longer threatened by hidden watchers. At 10 years old, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his alertness remained sharp, focused now on protecting his pack rather than detecting human threats that lurked in shadows. The community that had been selected as a testing ground for federal assassination techniques had become a model for constitutional oversight and citizen participation in monitoring government activities. Delegations of officials from other rural communities visited regularly, learning techniques for detecting and exposing federal programs that operated without proper authorization or oversight. The steel door still stood open, no longer concealing secrets but welcoming visitors who came to learn about the importance of citizen vigilance in protecting constitutional rights. Children from the local school took field trips to the memorial, learning about the families who had been murdered and the courage required to expose government crimes that violated the most fundamental principles of American democracy. As evening approached, Bonnie and Patricia walked back toward town, their conversation turning to the mundane concerns of community life, road maintenance, school funding, and preparations for the annual Harvest Festival that would honor both the victims of federal crimes and the courage of those who had exposed them. The mountain that had been Bonnie's sanctuary for 40 years remained unchanged in its essential character. But the human community that shared its slopes had been transformed by the revelation that some secrets are too dangerous to keep hidden. The peace that they now enjoyed had been earned through courage, sacrifice, and the understanding that democracy requires citizens who are willing to open doors that powerful people prefer to keep closed. As they reached the edge of town, Rex stopped and looked back toward the memorial garden, where lights now illuminated the names of families who'd been murdered for knowing too much about federal crimes. His vigil was no longer necessary. The truth had been exposed, justice had been served, and the mountain community was finally free from the shadow of systematic terrorism that had controlled their lives for 30 years. But vigilance remained important, because freedom requires citizens who understand that some doors must be opened, no matter how dangerous the secrets they conceal, and some truths must be told, regardless of the powerful people who prefer them to remain buried in hidden bunkers beneath the peaceful mountains of West Virginia.